My name is Adrienne, 34 years old, and I never thought my own father would cheer as my sister's palm cracked across my face in front of 99 elite guests at their 40th anniversary gala. The sharp sound echoed through the grand ballroom of our Lake Tahoe estate, silencing the string quartet as my sister screamed for me to hand over the deed to the property I had rightfully inherited. My mother did not rush to my side. Instead, she sipped her champagne and laughed, calling me a barren waste of the family bloodline because I couldn't provide the grandchildren they craved. In that moment of absolute betrayal, I realized the family I had spent decades trying to please was nothing more than a den of vipers, and the only way to survive was to strike back from the shadows. I walked out of that mansion with a burning cheek and a cold heart, making one quiet phone call that would effectively dismantle their entire world before the sun rose. Before I reveal the devastating aftermath of that call, I want to know about you. Please let me know in the comments what time you are watching this and which city you are in, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that respect should be earned, not just demanded by blood, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of survivors. Your support helps me share these truths and ensures that no one has to suffer in silence. Now let me take you back to where the rot first began, long before the lights of Lake Tahoe became the backdrop for my family's final act of cruelty. The cold winds of the Sierra Nevada mountains were a constant presence during my childhood, much like the chilling indifference of my parents Garrison and Meredith. Growing up in the shadow of the Tahoe estate meant learning early on that there was a hierarchy of love, and I was firmly at the bottom of it. Candice was 4 years older, a blonde-haired prodigy in their eyes, who could transform a blatant lie into a masterpiece of manipulation with just a flutter of her eyelashes. I remember a summer afternoon when I was barely 7, standing in the middle of the mahogany-paneled library, surrounded by the shattered remains of a glass sculpture my grandmother had cherished. Candice stood behind our father, her face a mask of faux terror, as she pointed a trembling finger at me, claiming I had been playing ball inside despite the rules. I tried to speak to explain that she had thrown it in a fit of rage, because I wouldn't give her my allowance, but the words died in my throat the moment Garrison's shadow loomed over me. He didn't ask for my side. He simply grabbed my arm and dragged me to the dark, damp cellar, locking the door for 6 hours, while the sounds of Candice enjoying an ice cream social with our mother drifted through the floorboards. Meredith was no better, often spending her afternoons critiquing my posture or the seriousness of my features, lamenting that I hadn't inherited her pageant-winning smile like Candice had. Every achievement I earned, from straight-A report cards to winning the regional debate championship, was treated as a basic expectation, a quiet obligation I owed to the family name. Meanwhile, Candice could barely pass her classes yet. Every mediocre effort she made was celebrated with extravagant gifts and public praise that made my chest ache, with a longing I eventually learned to suppress. By the time I was a teenager, I had become a ghost in my own home, a functional entity that existed to serve as a foil for Candice's perceived perfection. I watched as they funneled money into her failing hobbies and social aspirations, while I worked 2 part-time jobs just to save for a college application fee they refused to acknowledge. The divide wasn't just about favoritism. It was a deliberate erasure of my worth, a systematic dismantling of my identity to ensure that Candice would always be the sole star in their twisted galaxy. I spent my nights staring out at the dark waters of the lake, promising myself that one day I would build a life so formidable that they could never touch me again. Little did I know that my drive for independence would only make me a bigger target when their own manufactured world began to crumble under the weight of their greed. Life away from the Tahoe estate felt like breathing for the first time, especially after I met Julian during my first year working at a top-tier risk assessment firm in Chicago. He was an architect with a soul as sturdy as the structures he designed, providing the emotional scaffolding I had lacked for over 2 decades. We built a life defined by mutual respect and quiet ambition, far removed from the performative luxury of the Wilson household. However, the shadow of my family's expectations returned with a vengeance when we decided to start a family of our own, 3 years into our marriage. After months of trying and increasingly stressful visits to fertility specialists, a cold clinical diagnosis shattered our hopes. I had a severe case of uterine scarring and hormonal imbalances that made conception nearly impossible. Julian held me through the nights of grief. But when Meredith found out through a family friend who worked at the clinic, the sympathy I expected was replaced by a calculated public cruelty. During a rare Thanksgiving visit that I had hoped would be a bridge to reconciliation, my mother waited until the entire extended family was seated at the long oak table before striking. She sighed theatrically, looking at Candice's husband, Patrick, and then at me, with an expression of profound disappointment that made the air in the room feel heavy. "It truly is a tragedy, isn't it?" she mused, her voice carrying to every corner of the dining room. "The Wilson legacy stunted because Adrienne has always been too focused on her spreadsheets to care for her own body." The table went silent, but Candice didn't miss a beat, leaning forward with a smirk that didn't reach her cold eyes. She patted my hand in a gesture that felt like a slap, whispering loudly about how some women are just genetically deficient, and that nature has a way of weeding out the barren branches. Garrison merely nodded in agreement, stating that a woman without a womb was like a business without an asset, useless to the long-term growth of the family empire. Julian attempted to defend me, his voice rising in anger, but my father silenced him with a dismissive wave, suggesting that perhaps Julian should find a real woman who could actually fulfill her primary duty. We left that night, the tires of our car spitting gravel as we fled the estate. But the words they planted stayed with me like a slow-acting poison. They didn't see a daughter in pain. They saw a broken machine that had failed to produce the next generation of social currency. Every Christmas card thereafter was a subtle jab, with Candice sending photos of her lavish lifestyle and hints of future heirs, even though Julian and I knew she was drowning in debt and using our parents as a personal bank. I realized then that my worth in their eyes was tied solely to my utility, and since I could not provide a child, I was effectively dead to them. This isolation should have been my shield, but as the 40th anniversary approached, their desperation for a new infusion of capital made them remember the daughter they had so casually discarded. For nearly 5 years, the silence between me and the Tahoe estate was absolute, a self-imposed exile that allowed my wounds to scar over into a tough, resilient skin. Julian and I had found peace in our child-free life, pouring our energy into our careers and traveling to places my parents would only ever see in luxury magazines. Then, an unexpected delivery arrived at our Chicago home, a heavy cream-colored envelope embossed with gold foil containing an invitation to Garrison and Meredith's 40th wedding anniversary gala. Inside was a handwritten note from my father, written in a shaky script that suggested a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. He wrote about the fleeting nature of time and how he regretted the misunderstandings of the past, expressing a deep desire for both his daughters to be present as he celebrated this milestone. Julian was skeptical, his protective instincts immediately flaring up as he pointed out that my parents never did anything without a hidden agenda. "People change as they get older, Julian," I argued, perhaps out of a lingering, desperate hope that the little girl inside me still carried. Maybe facing 70 has made him realize that money can't buy a relationship with the only family he has left. I wanted so badly to believe that the invitation was an olive branch, a genuine attempt to heal the fractures before they became permanent. What I didn't know was that while I was thriving, the Wilson family business was hemorrhaging cash due to a series of disastrous medical supply contracts and Candice's reckless spending. My sister had convinced Garrison to invest heavily in a speculative crypto resort venture that had vanished overnight, leaving the family estate at Lake Tahoe as their only remaining liquidable asset. The problem was that the estate didn't belong to Garrison. It was held in a strictly managed living trust established by my grandmother, who had seen through her son's incompetence years ago. Grandmother had named me the primary beneficiary and sole trustee upon my 30th birthday, a fact my father had hidden from everyone, hoping he could pressure me into signing it away before I discovered the truth. I spent weeks preparing for the gala, choosing a dress that radiated confidence and researching a gift that was both thoughtful and expensive. I even reached out to an old contact in Nevada to get a pulse on the local social scene, hearing whispers of my father's mounting debts, but dismissing them as mere rumors. I convinced myself that this was the moment our family would finally move past the toxicity and embrace a future built on honesty. Julian couldn't attend due to a critical project deadline, but he kissed me goodbye and told me to trust my gut, a piece of advice I would soon realize was the only thing I should have packed. As I drove up the winding mountain pass toward the house that had been my prison and my playground, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. I believed I was walking into a celebration of love, unaware that I was actually stepping into a carefully orchestrated execution of my last remaining rights as a Wilson. The Tahoe estate was transformed into a glittering palace of glass and gold, with 99 of Nevada's most influential figures circulating through the gardens and grand halls. I stepped out of my car, the crisp mountain air biting at my skin as I adjusted the silk of my gown, feeling like an interloper in my own history. Meredith spotted me near the entrance, her smile as sharp and synthetic as the diamonds around her neck, giving me a double air kiss that felt like a cold breeze. She didn't ask about my life or my career. She simply commented that my choice of attire was brave for someone of my age and stature. I pushed past the insult, moving toward the center of the ballroom where Garrison stood holding court with a group of bankers and local politicians. He looked older, his face etched with a frantic energy that he tried to mask with booming laughter and expensive scotch. When he saw me, he didn't offer a hug but a firm, businesslike handshake, introducing me to his associates. Not as his daughter, but as the one who lives in Chicago. Candice was nearby, draped in a designer dress that I knew for a fact cost more than her husband's annual salary, her eyes tracking my every move with a predatory gleam. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that I couldn't quite place until the dinner service began and the speeches commenced. Garrison stood at the head of the long table, the 99 guests falling into an expectant silence as he raised his glass for the primary announcement of the evening. He spoke of legacy and the importance of passing the torch to those who truly understood the value of the Wilson name and its traditions. "Tonight is about more than just 40 years of marriage," he declared, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "It is about ensuring the future of this estate and our business by placing it in the hands of those who will carry it forward with dignity." He looked directly at Candice and Patrick, announcing that he had finalized plans to sell the Lake Tahoe property to a development group to fund a new family venture. The room erupted in polite applause, but I felt the blood drain from my face as the realization hit me like a physical blow. They were planning to sell a house that wasn't theirs to sell, treating my grandmother's legacy as a bargaining chip for their own survival. I waited for him to mention my name to acknowledge my role as the trustee, but he simply sat down, turning his back to me as if I didn't exist. Guests began to whisper, some looking at me with pity, and others with a morbid curiosity that made my skin crawl. I saw Candice leaning over to a prominent socialite, whispering about how I was difficult and had abandoned the family in their time of need. The gala wasn't a celebration. It was a public theater designed to legitimize their theft and humiliate me into submission before the guests. I realized that the handwritten note, the invitation, and the faux warmth were all part of a script to keep me compliant while they stripped me of my inheritance. I felt a surge of indignation that drowned out the noise of the party, a clarity that told me the time for hope was over, and the time for action had begun. The tension finally snapped during the cake-cutting ceremony, a moment that was supposed to be the pinnacle of family unity, but instead became the site of our final destruction. I approached the main table, my voice low but steady, as I asked to speak with Garrison and Meredith privately regarding the announcement about the house. Candice intercepted me, her face flushed with champagne and a cruel arrogance that she could no longer contain. "There's nothing to talk about, Adrienne," she hissed loud enough for the nearby guests to turn their heads. "The decision is made, and frankly, you should be grateful we even invited you to witness it." I looked past her to my father, demanding to know how he planned to sell a property that was tied to a trust he had no authority over. Garrison's face turned a dangerous shade of purple, his pride wounded by the fact that I was challenging him in front of his peers. He stepped forward, his voice a low growl, as he told me to shut my mouth and stop being a selfish, hysterical woman who didn't understand the first thing about family duty. I refused to back down, stating clearly that grandmother's will was explicit and that I would not sign any documents to facilitate a sale that would destroy her legacy. That's when it happened. Candice's hand flew out with a speed born of pure desperation and hatred, her palm making a sickening crack against my cheek. I stumbled back, the force of the slap ringing in my ears, as 99 people gasped in a collective horrified breath. Instead of horror, my mother let out a sharp, brittle laugh, clapping her hands together as if she had just witnessed a brilliant performance. "Give us the house, Adrienne," Candice screamed, her voice shrill and filled with venom. "You have no kids, no future, and no right to hold on to something you'll never pass down to anyone." Meredith leaned in, her eyes cold as ice, adding that I was nothing more than a barren waste of the Wilson bloodline, who was trying to spite the family out of jealousy for Candice's fertility. The guests stood in a frozen, uncomfortable silence, watching as my own parents encouraged the assault of their daughter. The physical pain was nothing compared to the clarity that washed over me in that moment. They had finally shown me the full extent of their monstrous nature. I didn't cry and I didn't strike back. I simply straightened my gown, looked each of them in the eye, and felt the last shred of my affection for them vanish. I turned and walked out of the ballroom, the silence of the 99 witnesses following me like a funeral procession. Once I was inside the safety of my car, I didn't drive away immediately. I took a deep breath, dialed a number I had kept for an emergency just like this, and waited for Mr. Sterling to pick up. "It's time, Adrienne?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. "Yes," I replied, my voice as cold as the lake water outside. "Execute the emergency protocols on the Wilson Living Trust immediately. Evict them all." I hung up the phone and watched the lights of the mansion in the rearview mirror, knowing that by morning the life they thought they had stolen was going to be reclaimed with interest. The sun had not yet crested over the Sierra Peaks when the first of the black SUVs arrived at the gates of the Tahoe estate, carrying the legal team and the sheriff's deputies. I was sitting in the back of Mr. Sterling's car, watching through the tinted glass as the luxury world my parents had built on lies began to implode. Garrison and Meredith were likely still asleep, or perhaps nursing hangovers from the previous night's victory, unaware that their time in the mansion had expired. The sheriff knocked firmly on the grand oak doors, and when a confused, disheveled Garrison opened it in his silk robe, he was met with a stack of legal documents and an immediate order to vacate. Mr. Sterling stepped out, his presence a stark contrast to the chaos, and explained that since the trustee me had found evidence of attempted fraudulent sale and mismanagement of trust assets, the emergency clauses had been activated. All accounts tied to the Wilson business that used the estate as collateral were frozen instantly, and the family venture Garrison had boasted about was now dead in the water. I watched as Meredith appeared behind him, her face pale and devoid of its usual makeup clutching her throat, as she realized the 99 guests from the night before would soon hear of their ruin. Candice and Patrick were hauled out of the guest wing, my sister screaming about her rights and her designer wardrobe as the deputies began tagging the furniture for inventory. It wasn't just about the house. Because Candice had used my parents' names to secure predatory loans, the legal cascade was pulling down their entire financial house of cards. I stepped out of the car, finally walking up the driveway I had once scrubbed as a child, and stood before them as they were led toward the gate. Garrison tried to lung toward me, calling me a traitor and a snake, but the sheriff held him back with a firm hand. "You didn't just lose a house, Garrison," I said quietly, my voice carrying in the still morning air. "You lost the daughter who would have actually saved you if you had treated her with a shred of humanity." Meredith began to sob, a pathetic performative sound that no longer moved me, begging me to think of the family image and how this would look to their social circle. I reminded her that she was the one who laughed while I was assaulted, and that in my world there is no inheritance for those who trade their children for a paycheck. Candice was a mess of smeared mascara and incoherent rage, realizing that the golden child was now a bankrupt outcast with nowhere to go. They were forced into their cars with only a few suitcases of personal belongings, the gates of the estate clicking shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the valley. Mr. Sterling handed me the keys to the property, but I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a profound sense of relief, like a weight I had carried for 34 years had finally been lifted. The Wilson legacy was officially over, and the house that had seen so much misery was now a silent monument to the fact that blood does not entitle anyone to abuse. I stood on the balcony overlooking the lake, watching the ripples on the water, and knowing that for the first time in my life, I was truly free. The months following the eviction were a whirlwind of legal filings and the quiet, steady process of dismantling what remained of the Wilson name. Garrison and Meredith attempted to sue to regain control of the trust, but the evidence of their attempted fraud was so overwhelming that their lawyers eventually abandoned the case. They moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a part of town they used to mock surviving on a meager pension that Garrison had managed to hide from the initial freeze. Candice, true to her nature, tried to pivot into a lifestyle influencer role, but the scandal of the gala and the subsequent bankruptcy made her a social pariah in Nevada's elite circles. Julian and I remained in Chicago, but I decided to convert the Tahoe estate into a sanctuary and retreat for women who had survived domestic and emotional abuse, giving the house a soul it had never possessed during my residency. I haven't spoken to any of them since that morning at the gate, and I don't plan to. The silence I now enjoy is the most expensive thing I own, and I won't trade it for a false reconciliation. This journey taught me that family is a term often used by predators to keep their prey in line, and that true loyalty is built on a foundation of respect, not DNA. If you find yourself in a situation where those who are supposed to love you are the ones breaking you down, remember that you have the power to walk away and build your own empire. You are not a barren branch or a waste just because you don't fit into someone else's narrow definition of success or utility. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community. If this story gave you a bit of courage or helped you realize your own worth, please share it with someone who might be struggling today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story of resilience and justice. Your voice matters, and your strength is greater than any slap or insult could ever be. Until next time, stay strong and remember that the quietest calls often lead to the loudest victories.